Imagine for a second that you're standing in a warehouse in Culiacan, Mexico, watching workers unload shipping containers marked agricultural equipment from China. Except inside those containers aren't tractors or irrigation systems. They're barrels of precursor chemicals that will become fentanyl. And in 72 hours, those chemicals will be pills that look exactly like prescription painkillers crossing into Texas in the gas tank of a Ford F-150. And the genius of it is that every single person in this chain, from the Chinese factory worker to the American pharmacy technician who unknowingly sells them, they all think they're doing something legal. And by the end of this, you'll understand why the Mexican cartels aren't just drug dealers, they're multinational corporations with supply chains that would make Amazon jealous. And the system works not because it's hidden, but because it's so integrated into legitimate business that pulling it apart would collapse entire economies. We've been told the cartels are about violence and cocaine and guys with gold-plated AK-47s, but the dark reality is that the modern cartel is a logistics company that happens to move drugs, and they control everything from the lime farms in Michoacan to the real estate market in Miami. And this isn't just about drugs. This is about why your avocado costs more this year, why there are 20,000 tortilla shops in Mexico paying protection money, why Chinese businessmen are moving billions through Los Angeles in cash. And if you think this doesn't affect you, the fentanyl crisis that killed 74,000 Americans in 2023, that's not a drug problem, that's a supply chain optimization problem, and the cartels solved it better than any legitimate business ever could. Let's start with the product, then pull back the curtain on how it moves, who profits, and why it's almost impossible to stop. The first thing you need to understand is that Mexico doesn't grow cocaine. The coca plant that becomes cocaine requires very specific conditions: high altitude, tropical climate, acidic soil, temperature and humidity ranges that exist pretty much only in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, so the cartels can't make it themselves. They have to buy it, and this is where the supply chain starts. In the mountains of Colombia, where farmers grow coca and process it into paste, then into powder, and Colombian trafficking groups take that finished product and move it north, usually by boat or semi-submersible submarine to Central America, places like Honduras, Guatemala, southern Mexico. And this is where the Mexican cartels step in. They're the middlemen. Their job is to get the product from Central America into the United States. And they've developed methods that are so effective that even when law enforcement seizes shipments, it barely makes a dent because it's a numbers game, and the cartels understand numbers better than most Fortune 500 companies. The most obvious method is trucks. Just load up commercial vehicles and send them through the border crossings. And if you send enough trucks, some will get searched, some will get caught, but most will slip through because US Customs can't physically inspect every vehicle. There aren't enough agents, there aren't enough hours in the day, so the cartels do the math. If you send 100 trucks and 10 get caught, you still moved 90 loads, and the profit from those 90 loads more than covers the loss of the 10. This is the preferred method of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. They rely on volume and speed, but the Sinaloa cartel, they prefer a different approach: tunnels. The tunnels aren't crude holes in the ground. They're engineered structures with ventilation, lighting, rail systems, and they're designed to connect warehouses on both sides of the border, so loading and unloading is seamless. And the reason the cartels fight so viciously for control of border territory is because you can't build a tunnel if you don't control both ends. And these tunnels represent years of investment, millions of dollars in construction, and they're incredibly effective until they're discovered. But by the time law enforcement finds one tunnel, 2 more are already being dug. But here's where it gets interesting. The cartels recently started using drones, and you might think drones, those must be the easiest targets. How could a drone carrying drugs possibly slip through? But remember, it's a numbers game. Drones are cheap, disposable, and even if you send 100 drones and only 10 make it, the value of those 10 loads justifies the cost of the 90 that got caught or crashed. And the thing about drones is, they don't require tunnels, they don't require drivers, they just need someone on each side with a controller. And the technology is getting better every year. Longer range, heavier payloads, GPS navigation, and law enforcement can't shoot down every drone. They can't even detect most of them, so the method keeps working. The most successful method, though, the one that moves the most product, is submarines. And we're not talking about the semi-submersibles that stick up out of the water like a sore thumb. Those get caught all the time because satellites and radar can spot them. We're talking about fully submersible submarines, the kind that go completely underwater, and the cartels have them now. And once these subs are underwater, they're nearly impossible to find. They don't show up on radar. They're designed to avoid sonar, and they can carry tons of cocaine in a single trip, making them extraordinarily cost-effective. But there's still one risk. If a sub gets caught, the operators might talk, they might snitch, they might give up information about routes and schedules. So the cartels are now developing remote control submarines. And we know this because authorities recently seized a submarine in Colombia that had a Starlink antenna on it for remote communication, meaning the cartels are using Elon Musk's satellite internet to pilot drug subs. And if that doesn't tell you how sophisticated these organizations are, nothing will. Now you might think, okay, they're good at moving cocaine, but cocaine has problems. It's a plant, which means it's subject to weather, disease, crop failures, and it's bulky. You need a lot of it to meet demand. So the cartels realize something. Why are we dealing with plants when we could deal with synthetic drugs that are more potent, require smaller shipments, and are way cheaper to produce? And this is where methamphetamine and fentanyl enter the picture. And this is where China becomes a key partner. Because fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that's 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. And meth is 3 to 4 times more potent than cocaine, but the effects last 10 to 20 times longer, and the profit margins are insane. But there's a problem. Mexico doesn't produce the precursor chemicals needed to make fentanyl or meth, so the cartels needed a supplier. And they found one in China, because it turns out Chinese chemical manufacturers and criminal networks supply most of the precursors for fentanyl and methamphetamine production. And here's how it works. The chemicals are manufactured in China, often legally, because the factories claim they're for industrial or pharmaceutical use, and then they're shipped to Mexico, usually mislabeled as something innocuous, and they arrive at Mexican Pacific ports like Manzanillo or Lázaro Cárdenas, and once the chemicals are on Mexican soil, they're transported to cartel-run labs where chemists synthesize fentanyl and meth powder. And the beauty of fentanyl, from a logistics perspective, is that because it's 100 times more potent than morphine, you need way less of it to fill demand, which means smaller shipments, less risk, more profit. And instead of pressing it into obvious blocks like cocaine, the cartels press fentanyl powder into pills that look exactly like legitimate painkillers. Xanax, Percocet, Vicodin, and these pills are trivially easy to smuggle because they look legal. And once they're in the United States, they're sold as prescription drugs, and users don't know they're taking fentanyl until it's too late. And because fentanyl is so potent, it's very easy to overdose, which is why 74,000 Americans died from fentanyl overdoses in 2023, accounting for nearly 70% of all overdose deaths in the country. And you might think, well, that's bad for business. Your customers are dying, but the cartels have done the math. The profit from fentanyl is so high that losing customers to overdose doesn't matter. There are always more customers, and the demand never stops. But here's the part people miss. The cartels are now making billions of dollars in the United States, cash, physical cash, and that creates a massive problem. How do you get billions of dollars in cash from Los Angeles back to Mexico without it getting seized? Because you can't just load a truck with cash and drive it across the border. That's too risky. And traditional money laundering methods like running it through restaurants and casinos, those still work, but they're slow and they're getting harder as financial regulators tighten controls. So the cartels needed a new method, and they found one. And it involves the Chinese again, but this time it's Chinese underground bankers. And the system they've created is one of the most elegant money laundering schemes ever devised. Here's how it works. A cartel operative in Los Angeles is sitting on $1 million in dirty cash from drug sales. Instead of smuggling that cash back to Mexico and risking seizure, he contacts a Chinese broker who operates inside the United States. And that broker has clients, wealthy Chinese individuals, who want to move money out of China. And they want to do this because China has strict capital controls. You can only move $50,000 out of the country per year as an individual. But if you're a wealthy Chinese businessman and you want to buy property in the US or invest in American companies, you need to move way more than $50,000. So the broker connects both sides. The cartel hands over $1 million in cash to the broker in the US, and simultaneously, the Chinese client sends the equivalent value in yuan to the broker's partner in China. And then the broker in China arranges for those funds to be transferred to one of the cartel's legitimate businesses in Mexico, and the cartel business sends an invoice to the Chinese broker for services rendered, consulting, logistics, whatever, and the money flows into the cartel's accounts in Mexico completely clean. And the beautiful part is the cash never crosses the border. It stays in the United States, where the Chinese client uses it to buy real estate or luxury goods or whatever they wanted in the first place. And the whole transaction is nearly untraceable because there's no wire transfer between the cartel and the Chinese client, no direct connection, just two separate transactions that happen to offset each other. And US officials call this one of the most powerful money laundering engines operating today. It's fast, it's scalable, it's almost impossible to detect, and it's now the preferred method for both the Sinaloa and CJ&G cartels, effectively replacing older laundering systems. So now the cartels have the product, they have the distribution network, they have the money laundering system, and with the wealth they've generated, they've accumulated power, enormous power, and they use that power in two ways. First, to expand into new revenue streams, and second, to eliminate anyone who challenges them. And this is where it gets really dark, because the cartels aren't content with just drug money anymore. They're systematically taking over entire industries in Mexico. And when I say entire industries, I mean tortillas, limes, avocados, industries that have nothing to do with drugs, but generate steady cash flow and give the cartels more control over the economy. 20,000 tortilla shops in Mexico, that's 15% of all tortillerias in the country, are currently being extorted by cartels. The owners have to pay protection fees, or the cartels burn down their shops or kill them. And if you think that's bad, the lime industry is even worse. In 2022, the Mexican government sent 660 soldiers and National Guard troops to Michoacan, specifically to protect lime growers who were being extorted by cartels. 660 soldiers to protect limes, and the avocado industry is the same story. Farmers forced to pay protection fees, and if they refuse, the cartels either kill them or take over their farms entirely. And the reason the cartels do this is because it's vertical integration. If you control the avocado farms, you control the supply. If you control the supply, you control the price. And if you control the price, you control the market. And now you're not just a drug cartel, you're an agricultural monopoly. And the profits from extortion and price manipulation go right back into the cartel's coffers. And there's almost nothing the government can do about it because the cartels have more money and more guns than most police forces. But drugs and extortion aren't the only revenue streams. Human trafficking generates an estimated $13 billion annually for the cartels, and that's a 2,500% increase from the $500 million they were making in 2018, which tells you everything you need to know about how aggressively the cartels are expanding into every possible criminal enterprise. Because human trafficking is profitable, the margins are high, the demand is constant, and the people being trafficked have no legal recourse. They can't go to the police, they can't fight back, they're completely vulnerable, and the cartels exploit that vulnerability ruthlessly, and the scale of it is staggering. We're talking about tens of thousands of people being moved across borders every year, forced into labor, forced into prostitution, forced into debt that they can never repay. And the cartels treat it like any other business: supply and demand, profit and loss, and the human cost doesn't factor into the equation at all. And this brings us to the most dangerous part: the cartel's relationship with power. Because in order to operate at this scale, in order to move billions of dollars in drugs and people and extortion money, the cartels need to neutralize threats. And the biggest threat is information. Journalists, reporters, people who investigate cartel activity and publish what they find. And Mexico is one of the deadliest countries in the world for journalists. Reporters who cover cartel dealings or government collusion do so at enormous personal risk. And the consequence is widespread self-censorship. As one veteran Mexican journalist put it, "You cannot count on the government. Self-censorship is the only thing that will keep you safe." And the statistics back this up. Less than 1% of journalist murders in Mexico result in convictions. Less than 1%, which means if you kill a journalist in Mexico, you will almost certainly get away with it. And the cartels know this. So they kill journalists, they kill their families, they kill anyone who might talk. And the result is that newspapers and radio stations in cartel-dominated areas, which is most of Mexico at this point, become mouthpieces for the cartels. They only publish stories that are favorable, or they don't publish anything about cartel activity at all. And the public loses access to information. And without information, there's no accountability. And without accountability, the cartels operate with impunity. But even when the cartels do get caught, even when law enforcement manages to arrest a major trafficker, it doesn't stop the operation, because the cartels have learned how to run their businesses from prison, and this isn't speculation, this is documented. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the founder of the Sinaloa cartel, managed the cartel from inside Mexican prisons for years. He orchestrated operations, gave orders, approved shipments, all from behind bars, and he escaped from maximum security prisons twice, once in 2001 and again in 2015. And after his second escape, which humiliated Mexican authorities, they extradited him to the United States in 2017 specifically to cut off his ability to run the cartel, and that's the only thing that worked, putting him in a US prison where he couldn't bribe the guards or coordinate with his network. And the reason this happens is because prison guards in Latin America are poorly paid, trained, and vulnerable to threats. And when you're dealing with organized crime structures, those threats extend beyond the prison walls. Guards who refuse to cooperate risk their lives and the lives of their families. There are numerous documented cases of guards who refuse to help cartel bosses being killed outside the prison. And so the rational choice for a guard making low wages is to cooperate, take the bribe, look the other way. And for the cartel bosses, prison is often safer than being on the outside, because inside prison, they're separated by gang affiliation. So there's no competition, no rival cartels, and they're protected from law enforcement operations. So they can run their business in relative safety. And the only time this breaks down is when they're extradited to the United States. And even then, the cartel continues. Because the structure is decentralized, there's always someone ready to step up and take over. Now let's talk about the incentives, because this is the part that explains why the system is so hard to dismantle. The cartels don't survive because everyone involved is evil. They survive because everyone involved is making rational decisions based on the incentives in front of them. And the incentives are overwhelming. Think about it like this. You're a farmer in Michoacan growing avocados, and a cartel representative shows up and says, "You're going to pay us 10% of your revenue every month, and if you don't, we'll burn your farm and kill your family." What do? You pay, because the alternative is death. And it's not just farmers, it's police officers. You're a cop in Sinaloa, making $500 a month, and a cartel member offers you $10,000 to look the other way during a shipment. What do? Because if you refuse, they might kill you. And if you accept, you can feed your family and send your kids to school. And this is how rational. People participate in irrational systems. The choice isn't between good and evil, it's between survival and death. And most people choose survival. The same logic applies to politicians. You're a mayor in a border town, and the cartel controls your city. They fund local businesses, they employ half the population, and they tell you to stay out of their way. What do? You stay out of their way, because if you fight them, they'll kill you and replace you with someone who cooperates, and the federal government can't protect you. They don't have the resources, they don't have the manpower, and even if they did, the cartels would just wait them out. Because the cartels aren't going anywhere. They're embedded in the economy. And this is what people don't understand about corruption in Mexico. It's not that everyone is corrupt because they're bad people, it's that the incentives to cooperate with the cartels are so strong and the incentives to resist are so weak that cooperation becomes the rational choice. And when cooperation is rational, the system perpetuates itself. And the cartels understand this. They're not just using violence, they're using economics, they're creating jobs, they're funding infrastructure, they're paying for schools and hospitals in areas where the government has failed, and people are grateful because the cartel is the only institution that's actually delivering services. And this creates loyalty, not loyalty based on fear, but loyalty based on reciprocity. The cartel helped my family, so I helped the cartel, and this is how the cartels embed themselves into communities. And once they're embedded, they're almost impossible to remove, because removing them would mean removing the only economic engine in the region, and nobody wants that. Not the people, not the politicians, not even law enforcement in some cases, because everyone benefits from the cartel's presence, even if they don't want to admit it. But the system does have weak points, and this is important, because if the system was perfect, it would be unstoppable. But it's not perfect. And the weak points are the same as in any large organization: complexity, human error, and internal conflict. Every additional step in the supply chain creates a data trail. Every intermediary is a potential informant. Every transaction is a potential leak. And the cartels know this, which is why they compartmentalize. The person who makes the pills doesn't know who ships them. The person who ships them doesn't know who sells them. And the person who sells them doesn't know who makes them. And this protects the organization, but it also creates vulnerabilities. Because if law enforcement can flip one person, they can start unraveling the chain. And this is exactly what happened in several major takedowns. Someone got arrested, they cooperated, they gave up the next link in the chain, and that person gave up the next link, and eventually the whole operation collapsed. The other weak point is internal conflict. Cartels are not monolithic. They're coalitions of smaller groups held together by mutual interest. And when those interests diverge, the coalition fractures, and we've seen this happen repeatedly. The Sinaloa cartel split after El Chapo's arrest. The Gulf cartel fractured into multiple factions. The Zetas broke away from the Gulf and then splintered themselves. And every time a cartel fractures, it creates opportunities for law enforcement. Because now the factions are fighting each other, and when they're fighting each other, they're not focused on protecting their operations. And that's when arrests happen. That's when shipments get seized. That's when informants come forward. So the cartel's greatest strength, their ability to coordinate large-scale operations, is also their greatest weakness, because coordination requires trust, and trust is fragile, and when it breaks, the whole system is vulnerable. And this brings us to the impact on you, because even if you've never touched drugs, even if you've never been to Mexico, the cartels affect your life. Every time a cartel buys a condo in Miami with cash, it drives up real estate prices for everyone. Every time a cartel launders money through a legitimate business, it distorts the market and makes it harder for honest businesses to compete. Every time fentanyl floods into the United States, it increases healthcare costs, increases law enforcement costs, increases the burden on social services, and you pay for that through taxes, through insurance premiums, through the cost of goods and services, and the violence spills over too, not just in border towns, but in cities across the United States, because the cartels have distribution networks in every major city, and those networks come with violence, turf wars, retaliation, and innocent people get caught in the crossfire, and the institutions you rely on, banks, police, government, they're all compromised to some degree, because the cartels have so much money that they can buy influence anywhere. And every time a bank pays a fine for laundering cartel money, instead of sending executives to jail, it teaches the market that crime pays, and that erodes trust in the system. And when people don't trust the system stops working. So let's recap. We've seen how the cartels operate as multinational logistics companies with supply chains that span from China to Colombia to the United States. We've seen how they've shifted from plant-based drugs to synthetic drugs because the margins are better and the logistics are easier. We've seen how they've partnered with Chinese chemical manufacturers and underground bankers to create a money laundering system that's nearly untraceable. We've seen how they've expanded into legitimate industries like agriculture and used extortion to control entire markets. We've seen how they've neutralized threats through violence and corruption and co-opted institutions from prisons to media to government. And we've seen how the system perpetuates itself through rational incentives that make cooperation more attractive than resistance. And the result is an organization that's more powerful than most governments, more profitable than most corporations, and more resilient than any law enforcement agency has been able to handle. And the next time you hear about a cartel bust or a record drug seizure, you'll understand that's not the system breaking down. That's just the cost of doing business. Because the cartels have already accounted for losses, they've already built redundancy into their supply chains, and they'll be back to full operation within days, if not hours. And this brings us to the next question. Where is this heading? Because the cartels aren't standing still, They're innovating, they're adapting, they're investing in technology, remote control submarines, encrypted communications, drone delivery systems, and they're expanding geographically, moving into Europe, into Asia, into Africa, because the model works. And if it works in Mexico, it'll work anywhere. And as long as there's demand for drugs, as long as there's inequality that makes cooperation rational, as long as there are weak institutions that can be corrupted or circumvented, the cartels will thrive. And the question isn't whether they'll be stopped. The question is whether the systems designed to stop them will adapt fast enough to keep up. And right now, the answer is no. The cartels are moving faster, thinking smarter, and operating at a scale that law enforcement can't match. And unless something fundamental changes, unless the incentives change, unless the demand changes, the cartels will continue to grow, and the impact on everyday life will continue to expand. And that's the reality. That's the system. And that's how the Mexican cartels actually work.